Hello, my name is Aidan Rupert, alongside me, Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 7 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. If you consider yourself a sports fan, be sure to subscribe to our WCHC Sports 88.1 FM YouTube page, where Rob and I will be posting our takes on the sports world each and every week. Today, we will be discussing the upcoming NBA Conference Finals, the Dallas Stars on the verge of a trip to the Stanley Cup Finals, excitement from week 1 of the NFL season, and more. Rob, before we get going, I have to ask you, are you a fantasy sports guy?
I'm a huge fantasy sports guy, Aidan. I had 3 fantasy football teams this year, each of which I followed very closely today during my 8-hour couch marathon. But it's sure great to add football back to the sports world here in 2020.
Yeah, not to flex on you too hard, but I am positioned well to go 1-0 in my fantasy football league. And it's funny, I'm not a football guy, nor do I know the nuances of fantasy football. So all my friends are trying to get me to draft a kicker in the 3rd round of our draft. I'm like, no, come on, what do you take me for? So glad I could get things off on the right foot.
Yeah, there's really no better feeling than getting a win on the first Sunday of fantasy football. I can tell you that much.
Absolutely. So before we get into things here, WCHC Sports would like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the podcast, and what would you like to see in the future? Be sure to leave a comment or contact WCHC Sports at g.holycross.edu today. We hope to hear from you. So Rob, figured we could start in the place where I like to start. There's a reason I'm wearing this jersey, and that is because the Boston Celtics have emerged victorious in their first ever playoff series against the Toronto Raptors, and they are on their way now to an Eastern Conference Finals matchup with the Miami Heat, following the Heat's 4-1 victory over the dominant Milwaukee Bucks. So really this series, you know me, we were talking about it, I don't think I've experienced a series quite that stressful in quite some time. And that's coming from the standpoint of just watching basketball. Put my own loyalties to the Boston Celtics aside. It was frustrating. It was exciting. Boston blowing a 2-0 lead and then nearly blowing a 3-2 lead in the series, as Game 7 ultimately proved to be an absolute dogfight, with Boston just barely coming out on top.
Absolutely, and really any Game 7, like you said, all biases aside, just gets the blood pumping. I mean, I had no dog in the fight when I was watching the end of this game. And when it came down to the wire, I was into it. I'm sure you remember texting you after the game how upset I was about some of those shot selections for the Raptors in the final moments. But I think it's been a great thing for the NBA. I have this weird feeling that the competition has honestly gotten better this postseason than some of the postseasons of past. I just feel like I'm seeing Game 7s left and right, overtime games sprinkled here and there. It's really been a great thing for the NBA in a season that's certainly been unprecedented.
Yeah, definitely, Rob. And you can tell how badly the players want this. A whole lot went into making this Orlando bubble possible. And as much as we've seen, distractions to the game itself, warranted distractions at that, but you can tell that just the teams that are still out there, they want to make the most of this. And I actually liked Jimmy Butler's comments from a week or two ago about how this is a business trip, and that's why he chose not to invite any close friends or family members to the Orlando bubble. And he wasn't so much imparting judgment on his teammates that chose to do so. Obviously, guys have wives, guys have children, but I just thought the business trip approach was sort of a funny way of phrasing it, but it makes a lot of sense. And definitely the Celtics looked at this series as a business trip. And this series, Toronto-Boston, just a few notes on it, it showed me a lot just about basketball and what it has become. Because a lot of people, they criticize today's NBA players, and by extension the officials, for being soft. Paul Pierce actually he was in the news a couple of days ago. He said that he would average 50 points in today's NBA just because of how the game has changed. And I would like to remind Mr. Pierce that he retired only 3 years ago in 2017. He's speaking of this as though it's an entirely new era, which it is in some respects. But the thing that I have to say about that is, yeah, people talk about the lack of hand checking in today's NBA. Everything's a foul, whether it's, landing underneath a jump shooter's feet. But what people do not realize is just the sheer complexity of today's game and just how basketball has evolved. Not so much in the Orlando bubble, but if you look at a game under any regular circumstances, you see literally 10 to 15 assistant coaches or team personnel behind the bench. And those are your analytics guys. Those are your video coordinators. The staff of teams, especially top tier teams, it's so integral to team success, as the scouting is absolutely off the charts. And I think now more than ever, teams just know how to exploit players for their weaknesses. And that's not to say that's not something we saw back in what many consider the golden age of basketball, the 80s and 90s. But really, I think it's selling today's players and teams short by labeling it as soft, because, yeah, in many respects it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's easier. And we saw Toronto throw so many defensive looks at the Celtics. And I don't think there's a single coach outside of Brad Stevens in the NBA that would have had the smarts about him to sort of crack that box in one defense, and just the shifting zones Toronto was sort of pulling out of left field.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up this debate between, the NBA of the 80s and the 90s and the NBA today. That term soft does come up a lot. And while I do think some people with that opinion do have some reason behind, the idea that I think the NBA is certainly called, from an officiating standpoint, a lot more lenient and a lot more, friendly to players on the offensive side of the ball. Your point about the game getting faster, smarter, stronger is certainly correct. And I think there are plenty of cases to be made that the NBA talent-wise is better off than it's ever been in terms of just how deep the league is. I think you still had a really great crop of legends in that 80s and 90s era that were just built for playing more physical basketball. But I think Paul Pierce's comments about how he could score 50 today are ridiculous. He couldn't score 50 in the 80s and 90s. He couldn't score 50 when he was playing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's ridiculous. I think some people that make this case that the 80s and 90s was by far and away the better era of basketball is not true. I think there's still a case to be made for that group of players who really brought the league to where it is today in terms of popularity. But this Toronto-Boston series, I agree, was anything you could have wanted as a basketball fan, and it really highlighted where the game was going strategically and analytically.
And Rob, talk about a guy that has both the size and the strength and the smarts to dominate a series. How about what LeBron James is doing with his Los Angeles Lakers team right now, as they took care of business against the Houston Rockets in 5 games to advance to the Western Conference Finals. And LeBron himself, he had a few quiet outings to start off the postseason here and there, but he's simply asserting his dominance right now, looking once again like the best player in the world. And that was against a team with very strong wing defenders between PJ Tucker, Daniel House Jr., Rob Covington, Jeff Green. Like, those are, I'm not saying they're LeBron stoppers by any means, but relatively speaking, and by comparison, that's sort of the best you can get. And he just made it look easy against them. And we're definitely seeing playoff LeBron right now. But how about playoff Rondo as a savvy veteran just coming off, I want to say it was a hand injury of some sort. And he's been inserted into sort of a 6-man type role for the Lakers. And he has had some very strong performances.
Absolutely. And I think the performance we've been seeing from LeBron not only is typical for him each year in the playoffs, but I think the way he can just up his game to that next level in the biggest moments separates him from, one of the most dominant players of his era to one of the most dominant players of all time. When you look at that top echelon of NBA athletes, LeBron, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, they all made their money in the clutch. And I think this is a point you were planning on touching upon a little bit later. I find that dynamic of being clutch as that extra factor you need to become a great player, in the fact that the Lakers and the Rockets seemed like two totally different teams after game one. The Rockets are just perennially a team that can't close it out in the big moments. And the Lakers with LeBron have clearly proven that they're capable of doing that. They lost game one in both of these series and turned it around real quick. I was hoping I could get your thoughts on this idea of Houston being a flashy regular season team, and maybe the fact that James Harden is that same kind of player, flashy, but when it comes to being that next great legend in the NBA and getting things done, he just can't.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's in many respects hard to watch because, and I remember you mentioning this in one of our first one or two episodes of this podcast, Houston being a flashy regular season team. It's difficult because continually they cannot come up big when it matters the most. And obviously, as the saying goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And granted, Daryl Morey with that franchise, they did shake things up coming into this year. They made a gutsy trade in sending Chris Paul off to Oklahoma City in exchange for Russell Westbrook. But at the end of the day, they really utilized a similar formula where they went small, they shot a lot of threes, and they shot themselves straight out of it. And I know hindsight is 2020, and that Rockets OKC series in the first round was so fun to watch. I almost feel as though Chris Paul is in so many ways the ideal backcourt running mate to James Harden as opposed to Russell Westbrook, because obviously Westbrook in this series, he was coming off an injury and he wasn't himself other than one game in which I think he scored 25 points or in that neighborhood. But they play well when they can just space the floor. They really zip the ball around great. The problem is Westbrook is the one guy on that team ever since they traded Capella that is virtually a non-threat as a perimeter jump shooter. And he continues to take these shots, and you can't fault him because they're open looks, and he needs to maintain some sort of credibility for closing out on him if you're an opposing defender. But he simply could not buy a three-point look or even his patented mid-range jump shot. And it just makes me think, what if Daryl Morey had said, we're going to run it back one more time with Chris Paul? I don't think it would have necessarily changed the outcome of this series. I think the Lakers were so clearly the dominant team behind the play of LeBron, AD, and again, one more shout out to Rondo. But at the end of the day, maybe they could have positioned themselves in a better seed, not have had to face the Lakers until a conference finals, and maybe bank on someone else knocking them out before then. So again, hindsight is 2020, but it is frustrating to watch the Houston Rockets and their small ball formula, which works great during the regular season, but we just saw it exploited.
For sure. You see this 3-point trend, coming over the NBA. And going back to your point on Westbrook, it almost seems like a solid outside jumper is almost a requirement in today's NBA. Guys like Westbrook and Ben Simmons, who have just ridiculous athleticism, can get a free pass and sort of overcome that deficiency in their game with great playmaking ability. But going back to your point on 3-point shooting for the Rockets and how it just didn't come through for them again, you're starting to wonder if 3-point shooting is more of a regular season metric as opposed to a playoff metric, so to speak, and kind of highlights the idea that there are certain intangibles to a team, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that end up being very helpful in playoff runs and sort of less appreciated or valued during the regular season.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And obviously that's not to say the 3-point shot suddenly becomes obsolete in a playoff situation. Obviously, going back to Toronto, Boston, we saw throughout the first 6 games, the team that shot better from 3, they won the game. But then this past Friday, Game 7 ended up being 92-87 in Boston's favor, an extremely low-scoring game by today's standards, even playoff standards. And when it came down to it, neither team could buy a bucket, and it all came down to a couple of inside drives, a couple of trips to the foul line. And I think it was sort of a fitting end to a series, because even though analytics screamed take more three-pointers, I think both teams had the wherewithal to recognize we're just not hitting right now. We need to reinvent, or we are packing our bags and going home. So I think there is a lot to be said. And really, I'm just curious as to where Houston goes from here, because today we actually had the news come out of Houston that Mike D'Antoni, he said no to coming back to Houston. All reports indicate that the team wanted their head coach back, but he didn't want to run it back with his guys, and he declared himself a free agent, so to speak. So he's still looking to get an NBA coaching job elsewhere, but I guess even he was just exhausted of seeing the same small ball formula that he endorses, to be fair, but seeing it fail over and over again come the postseason.
Definitely. I think D'Antoni has always been one of those guys who's very innovative offensively and brings something to the league. Each time he gets a new coaching job that people really haven't seen before, he's presided over some fantastic talent, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Names like, obviously, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, Chris Paul, Carmelo Anthony, all come to mind. But going back to the defensive argument, I don't think his teams have ever been really strong fundamentally or on the defensive side of the ball. We did talk about Houston being a much improved defensive team from last year, but it seemed like it really wasn't enough for D'Antoni's squad. And while I think he will find work in the future as a coach in the NBA, he's been very successful over his career. You start to wonder if he's one of those guys who, coaches great teams in the regular season, a guy like Tom Thibodeau did, but once it came playoff time, you start to see sort of the flaws of D'Antoni's coaching philosophy get exposed, and see his team get bounced early on in the second round.
It's difficult, Rob. And one last note on it. Let's not overlook the fact that the Lakers, if you really break it down, they beat the Rockets at their own game, because the Rockets, they stuck with their small ball lineup that they've been rolling with ever since they traded Clint Capella back to Atlanta, or over to Atlanta back in February. But the Lakers, I think it was game 4 of the series, where the Lakers said, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going small too. And they pulled both JaVale McGee and Dwight Howard essentially from the series, and they opted to play Anthony Davis at the 5, which granted they've been doing all along in terms of the fourth quarter when it comes down to it. But they eventually said, okay, you got one game on us. We're beating you, but we're going to beat you even more. And we're going to do it the way that you think you have a shot against us. So it was just adding insult to injury. And the question for Houston now is not so much just philosophy, although that's certainly a big piece of it, but where do they go from here, as virtually their entire rotation, they're all under contract for next season with the exception of Jeff Green, who was on a 1-year minimum deal. So if you're any team, like if you're Houston rather, where do you look? Where's the personnel going to come from that you sort of want to plug into your system? Westbrook is making $40 million a year. Harden's making $40 million a year. And that's not to say they would look to trade either one of those players after just one season of experimentation with them. But it's difficult. It's a very hard spot to be in because, as mentioned, they're such a great regular season team, and you can't take away from that success. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of line drawn between contending for a championship and just, being stubborn. So we will see what ends up happening with Houston this offseason. But jumping real quick into the other series that is still going on, the lone series for the second round that we still have going on. Today, Rob, we saw the Clippers struggle to close out again as the Denver Nuggets had an impressive, I want to say 34-point swing thereabouts, and they forced a Game 7 against a Clipper team that many had already written into a conference finals matchup with the Lakers.
Yeah, and I was one of those people that was all in on the Clippers. Going back to the start of the NBA bubble, I had them in the Bucks going to the finals. I thought just being the deepest team in the NBA would be too much for any Western Conference team to overcome en route to the finals. But I'm starting to doubt that pick more than ever now, and I'm even starting to doubt if the Clippers have what it takes to get past the second round. We talked about the Rockets being a team who has a lot of off-season considerations after their loss to the Lakers. I think if the Clippers bow out in 7 to the Nuggets, the front office is going to have to take a really deep, long, hard look at this roster that they've committed so much money and so much draft capital to. When you think of what they traded to bring in Paul George along with Kawhi Leonard, I want to say the Clippers still have it in them to close out Game 7 and make it a really competitive series with the Lakers. But in the NBA playoffs, you only get so many chances to right your wrongs. And if the Clippers want to stay alive and, correct the wrongs they had in this series, they need to do it fast, because Nikola Jokić has had a phenomenal series. He's been the hottest player on the floor the past few games. And the Nuggets look like they have all the momentum right now. They've been a playoff-tested squad before. They play well together. They've been through multiple postseasons before, and they're looking to make their first Western Conference Finals in a long time.
Yeah, you're right, Rob. Denver, obviously, they are simultaneously an up-and-coming team, yet a team that is somewhat battle-tested, much like the current rendition of the Boston Celtics, albeit a bit less so, as Boston is now going to their third conference finals in the last 4 seasons. But for Denver, the thing about it that I think people are overlooking is, you're right, they're running the same core back, whereas the Los Angeles Clippers, they look outstanding on paper. They really do. And frankly, I'm going to push back, Rob. I don't think that if they are disappointed in a Game 7 loss this season, I don't think they take too long a look at shifting things around this offseason, because of just how good they are on paper. It will really be a disappointing outcome, but I think that all the pieces are there. But the thing about the Clippers is they don't have as much experience playing with one another. There were several injuries throughout the season. There was Kawhi Leonard, Paul George managing their load management, so to speak, as well as the midseason acquisitions of Marcus Morris as well as Reggie Jackson, who both received minutes. And the thing is, I don't think they've played their best basketball yet. But if they haven't yet, when is it going to be? Because the clock is running out on their season. They could easily have a weak showing on Tuesday night, and suddenly they're out of it just as quickly as things got started. And that's not to take away from what Denver's doing. It's impressive, and they are battle-tested, as you mentioned. They are currently seeking to become the first team in NBA history to recover from 2 3-1 deficits in the same postseason, and only 12 teams, including themselves in the previous round, have ever done it. And furthermore, this is the 4th straight playoff series for the Nuggets that has featured a Game 7, as they took down the Spurs before falling to the Blazers in last year's playoffs, both series 7 games. And obviously, as just mentioned, they went 7 against the Jazz in the first round here. So really, it's the play of Murray, it's the play of Jokić, who is just putting up video game numbers right now. He had 34, 14, and 7 assists today, and he is unquestionably asserting himself as the best offensive big man in basketball, if not one of the best offensive players, period. He possesses so much versatility. And Rob, I want to get your take on this before we move on to some quick predictions for the conference finals. Do you think that it is worth sending double teams at Nikola Jokić?
No, and I don't think it's a very hard answer to that question, because, if you take one look at his playmaking ability and, his ability to distribute to his teammates, there's no point in sending double teams at him, because he'll just pick out the open guy, swing it to him, and, drill the open 3. Jokić, it's funny you bring him up, because ever since he's kind of risen to this level of stardom as arguably a top 10 player in this league, especially the way he's performing right now.
I think for sure
Jokić kind of reminds me he reminds me as a guy who you see at, your local gym or YMCA that doesn't look very good. He doesn't have the athletic build. His movements are kind of quirky and unorthodox, but he ends up just dropping 30 points and 10 assists on your head and just completely shocks everyone in the gym. And I think that's what he's doing now, and that's what he's been doing for his entire career. I think he throws just a different brand of basketball, something we touched on in one of the very first episodes we recorded. And his way of playing is just so unorthodox that it takes a while for players to adjust and learn how to defend them. And in a 7-game series, that's not a whole lot of time to get to know who you're playing against.
Honestly, Rob, that description really resonated with me, as I am that guy at the local gym in nearly every regard. But I will say, just playing a pickup game, I wish I had the same kind of cutters on my side that Nikola Jokić has. As great of a passer he is, his teammates do not receive enough credit for how easy they make it for him. He obviously has passing wizardry, but I've just been observing this over the last couple of games. Jamal Murray, Torrey Craig, and Michael Porter Jr., and I'll even throw Gary Harris into that conversation. But those are 3 or 4 of the best off-ball cutters in the NBA. They just know where to be relative to any defense's efforts to double-team Jokić. And frankly, it's a recipe for success that is underutilized in today's NBA. You don't see a ton of double teaming just because there are only so many guys that can back you down and punish you every trip down the floor. But Denver really has, I think, found a recipe for success that could very well lead them to a conference finals matchup against the Lakers.
Absolutely, Aidan. I agree.
So what do you think, Rob? Let's say, well, let's start out East. We got Celtics, Heat. What does your gut tell you on this series?
Thing is, my gut isn't right most of the time, so it's hard to ask me that question. But
there's Charles Barkley. I don't know if you catch this on Inside the NBA. He loves to guarantee team wins, and then it's hilarious. Time after time, they get blown out. And anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're spot on about Barkley. He's the kind of guy who sees, for example, the Portland Trail Blazers win Game 1, even before the series. If no basketball has been played, he's the type of guy to take Portland, in 4 or 5 games. But all, terrible analysis aside, it's hard because I think Miami, in accordance with their name, are just so hot right now and just playing the best basketball they can. I think the Celtics, while they've delivered a really strong performance this postseason, especially against Philadelphia, they looked like clearly the more dominant team. And even in this series against Toronto, the way they battled back after 2 really tough losses in games 3 and 4. I think Miami is hot right now, and they know they're hot. And the way they're playing with so much confidence and trust in each other, getting guys like Tyler Herro involved, who, is a rookie, just 20 years old. He's bombing threes over people's heads. And his teammates are loving it. Bam Adebayo has been a force inside like he has all season. Jimmy Butler has fully come into that role as a leader on that team. And, I hate picking against the Celtics with you here, Aidan, but I think that series is going to take some time for the Celtics to recover from in terms of health and, mental acuity, so to speak. I think the Heat will be well rested. I think they're playing at a level that even they thought wasn't possible right now. So I'm going to pick the Heat in 7 games.
That's a fair point, Rob. They are absolutely smoking right now, and they should be playing with a lot of confidence after what they just did to Milwaukee. I'm going to push back, and here's why. I'm taking the Celtics in this series in 6 games, and the reason for that is that Miami truly is a unique team. They have weapons at every position. They're another team a la the Raptors and Celtics that are willing to throw a zone defense at you and really not just make you work, but make you have to think each and every trip down the floor. And the thing about it, though, is the Celtics just came off a series in which that's what they're used to. They had to both outplay and outthink the Toronto Raptors every trip down the floor. And as impressive as Miami's victory against Milwaukee was, Milwaukee really only excels at one thing. Two things, I should say. Great team defense and drive and kick and swing the ball around the perimeter. I think that the Celtics just bring so much more versatility on offense that it's going to be tough for Miami to adapt on the spot. And they have veteran players like Jokić, like Butler, who they've been in these playoff situations before, although this is Jimmy Butler's first trip to the conference finals, it is worth noting. But the Celtics, to me, just appear to be the team that are better equipped to adjust on the fly. I think on paper, I'm going to take the Heat just because of their personnel. But in terms of a team's flexibility and fluidity, I think that the Celtics, also as a battle-tested team that really had to have their wits about them against Toronto, I think that they know just a little bit more what they're getting themselves into in this series. So I'm going to take Celtics in 6, and hopefully Gordon Hayward will make a mid-series appearance coming off that ankle injury.
That would be great to see, and I certainly have no problems with picking the Celtics, especially in a year after we lost Kobe Bryant. We could see a potential Celtics-Lakers NBA Finals, which would just be a fantastic thing for the NBA, not only ratings-wise, but just for the legacy of the game, seeing two storied franchises almost 10 years after their last NBA Finals showdown come back to the promised land in such a divisive, controversial, unprecedented year in basketball. So with that being said, I'm going to go with the Lakers in the West, no matter who comes out of this Nuggets-Clippers series. I think either team, like the Celtics, will be fatigued after a very difficult contest, and the Lakers will come off of multiple days rest in lieu of their dominant win against the Rockets. If the Clippers win and they thought guarding Nikola Jokić was hard and the rest of that team, I just wait until they see LeBron James and Anthony Davis the way they're playing this late in the playoffs. They've gotten plenty of games under their belt with each other. They have a chemistry that makes them the most unguardable duo in the NBA, in my opinion. And there just comes a point where, as good as Kawhi Leonard is, as good as Paul George is, the king is the king. And I think LeBron James, when you face him in the playoffs, it takes an exceptional effort all around your team to beat him 4 times in 7 games.
Yeah, Rob, if I'm a Lakers fan, I love that. The king is the king. I'm putting that on a T-shirt. And for that very reason, the king being the king, I agree with you. I think that this is the Lakers series to lose, no matter their opponent. And I'm not saying that I'm not going to give you a Charles Barkley guarantee, say Lakers in 4 or 5 games. I think it's going to be a tough series either way. But I think that they are favored. And frankly, that's not what I was expecting coming into the playoffs. You mentioned your pick was Bucks Clippers. I was sort of thinking the same thing, but I think that the Clippers haven't quite shown me enough over these past 2 rounds, if they even make it to the conference finals. I almost feel like, from a matchup standpoint, I'm not saying the Nuggets are a better team than the Clippers. Frankly, I don't think they are. I think they're more of a wild card if they end up getting the conference finals matchup against the Lakers. And again, let me reiterate, I think the Clippers are the better team. For some reason, I like the Nuggets against the Lakers just a tiny bit more. I think that they don't quite have – obviously the Clippers have the wing defenders, but who are the Lakers going to stick on Jamal Murray? They have Rondo coming off the injury. They have serviceable guys. They have Caldwell Pope, Caruso. But I think that's going to be an issue. They don't necessarily have a lockdown player at the guard position. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. But I am with you. I'm going to go Lakers in any event, no matter who ends up reaching that series.
Yeah, I think the Lakers are the surefire pick. Although the wild card kind of term you put on the Nuggets, I think, is a perfect way of saying it. I almost feel like the Lakers are a safer pick if you want the series to be competitive. But when I look at the Nuggets, I either see them getting, either swept or bounced in 5 games if they go face the Lakers, or they push it to 7. It really just depends what kind of Nuggets team you see coming out of 2 series that went Game 7. So, it really remains to be seen who does have the best chance of beating the Lakers. But going back to your point on who's going to guard Jamal Murray, this has been done before, and I'm sure a team with LeBron James will do it again. Throw the king on Jamal Murray and see what happens. You saw similar defensive strategies in the 2011 Eastern Conference Finals, I believe, with Derrick Rose coming off of his MVP season, really getting worked, unfortunately, as a Bulls fan, by LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, too, in that series. So it'll be interesting to see how the Lakers approach whoever comes out of that Western Conference semifinal.
Yeah, Rob, 34, 35 years old. It doesn't matter. The king is still the king.
Well put, indeed. And before we move on to the NHL, do you ever find yourself thinking about sports while indulging in some afternoon TikToks? Do your friends ever complain that all you talk about is sports? Most importantly, though, do you feel that Raptors head coach Nick Nurse lost his team the series by failing to play Holy Cross alum Malcolm Miller in Game 7? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, WCHC Sports has a place for you. For information on opportunities to broadcast, podcast, and everything in between, email wchcsports@g.holycross.edu today. So moving on to the NHL, Aidan, we talked about how exciting and unprecedented this Dallas Stars playoff run was last week. And it looks like that narrative will be around for at least another few days, as they've gone up 3-1 against the Vegas Golden Knights in the Western Conference Final with a 2-1 win yesterday, that being Saturday night. And ever since filling in for the injured Ben Bishop in the opening round, the 10th-year goalie for the Stars, Anton Khudobin, has won 10 of 14 starts with a shutout and a .920 save percentage to his name. And Khudobin, who is with his 5th NHL team over the last 10 seasons, has not only provided some much-needed stability at the position for the Stars in the postseason, but he's really gone above and beyond for a few of these games, including that 2-1 victory on Saturday, and has the Stars on the brink of their first finals appearance since 2000, so make that 20 years, and their first title since the season before, 1999. And, all this success, Aidan, has come in a neutral site, the Western Conference bubble in Edmonton. And before the show, we were discussing some of the challenges that come with playing away from home, more specifically in a bubble format like the one we're seeing in basketball and hockey. So I'd like to pose you a question about, what similarities are there, and hopefully you do what you do best, make the NBA analogous to the NHL.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. I am quite aware of where my strengths lie. And let's just say that really putting things in my terms or basketball terms really is what's going to get us through this podcast moving forward. But truly, there are some similarities to be drawn. In the NBA this year, for instance, this is the first time in the history of the league that a Eastern Conference Finals has featured neither the 1 seed or the 2 seed. And the NBA obviously has been around so many years, and the fact that that had never happened was honestly a little bit surprising to me, but it definitely speaks to how different this year is, as both the NBA and NHL, they're the 2 most prominent leagues that have elected to utilize this bubble format for their postseason. So, it possesses, or it rather presents, these really unique challenges. We talk about the intensity, especially of a Game 7, and teams often derive so much comfort just by knowing, even if after a tough loss, that they're going home to play in front of their home crowd, and that their home crowd has them, it has their back. So really there's so much to be said for home court, home field advantage across all of sports. And the fact that that's gone right now, obviously the players themselves will rarely be inclined to point to the lack of home fans as any sort of excuse or justification for their loss. Quite frankly, I think it was Mark Jackson maybe on an NBA broadcast talking about he likens the current bubble format being employed to a laboratory approach to research in which all variables are carefully controlled for. And you have players that, they wake up same time most days. They don't have to get on a plane. I don't know what the NHL situation is, but they might not even have to get on a bus or a short bus ride if at all. So I think the players will obviously be hesitant once again to point towards their lack of fans as any sort of reasoning for their failure to execute. But at the same time, we are currently dealing with sports in a setting in which we've never seen them before. And really what we're seeing with the Dallas Stars right now is that it creates the possibility for anything to happen.
That's right. And we may see baseball teams ultimately deal with some of these challenges you mentioned of playing in a bubble and these scheduling quirks of playing at a neutral site in a global pandemic. As the MLB has recently been considering pushing their MLB postseason into a bubble format as well, although it remains to be seen if that is actually what will happen because, minus a few bumps in the road here and there, it seems like the MLB's coronavirus problem has slowly started to curtail itself, and teams are starting to play normal schedules again as we approach the postseason. But going back to hockey, Aidan, over in the East, the Tampa Bay Lightning haven't showed any signs of caving to the pressure of being the favorite like they did a year prior as the number one seed, getting bounced in the first round. They too sit one win away from the Stanley Cup Finals, their first appearance since 2015. And the Lightning have certainly looked like the most complete team this postseason, the way I see it. And the stats are there to prove it. They've had by far and away the best winning percentage this postseason. That's 75%, nearly 12 points higher than the closest team. On the offensive side, winger Nikita Kucherov leads all skaters with 17 postseason assists. And defensively, Tampa and goaltender Andrei Vasilevsky have surrendered the fewest goals out of the remaining teams in the postseason. And should they finish off the Islanders, the Lightning will be favored no matter who comes out of the West, whether that be the Stars, sort of the upstart team, or the Vegas Golden Knights, a squad that I thought had the potential to make their own deep postseason run at the beginning as well.
Yeah, Rob. And honestly, talk about Tampa Bay and their failures to really live up to the hype last year. Sometimes that's what it takes to succeed in professional sports. It's very rare that you have a group of guys, especially within an organization. There are obviously exceptions when it comes to big trades, big free agency signings, but sometimes it takes the sting of failing to live up to where you want to be to get to that point the next year. And right now, what we're seeing with Tampa Bay is they are setting themselves up presumably for a David versus Goliath type matchup in the Stanley Cup with the Dallas Stars. And it'll definitely be something that I think is going to generate a whole lot of interest, even among casual fans of hockey. And it's not where we thought we would be, but I don't know about you, Rob. I cannot complain.
Yeah, and the Stars, honestly, the way they're playing, I don't think look like a David whatsoever, although I certainly understand your comparison between the two teams in terms of talent. On paper, the Lightning are far superior. But it was interesting you brought up that point about what it takes to win as a team that has so much perennial success. It reminds me of, staying within the realm of hockey, the Washington Capitals a few years ago, led by Alex Ovechkin, a player who will easily go down as one of the greatest in his generation, but never having a championship to his name. And it wasn't until 2018 that he finally got to lift the Stanley Cup, almost 13 years after he was drafted. It took so many heartbreaking series and losses in the postseason for Ovechkin to get that Stanley Cup. And we may be very well seeing the same storyline here with the Lightning.
Yeah, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and we are seeing that in hockey right now.
But moving from one Tampa Bay team to another, going over to the NFL, Tom Brady made his highly coveted Buccaneers debut against the Saints this afternoon. But it didn't go quite as planned for the GOAT, so to speak, in football, with Brady and the Bucs falling 34-23. The 43-year-old looked pretty sharp early on with a touchdown on the opening drive, but he ended up throwing 2 interceptions later in the game and showed some major frustrations with Singy Saints defense, and it has led many to question whether or not the Buccaneers, and more specifically Tom Brady, being so old, are they built for a deep postseason run that they were sort of constructed to do? I think it's a little early to react on a loss like this. The Saints are arguably the best team in the conference. And when you bring a seasoned veteran like Tom Brady in a receiver room with a lot of young guys like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, it's going to take some time for them to get on the same page and develop that chemistry that's so important in really good wide receiver quarterback connections. So certainly wouldn't count the Bucs out of the playoffs just yet. They have a fairly easy schedule this season, and with that much talent on the offensive side of the ball, it's really hard for me seeing them missing out on this year's postseason.
Yeah, and going back to Brady and his performance today, you almost get the feeling that there were some butterflies. Obviously, he came out, had some great plays, a lot of adrenaline, but even for a guy that's been doing it as long as he has, just frankly, the change of scenery, not to even mention the change in circumstances. Obviously, everyone's dealing with the same thing, but no or few fans in the vicinity. Like it's definitely something that has to factor into even a seasoned vet who has faced so many tumultuous circumstances over the years. But he did not look like himself down the stretch of the game, and it was just on another note, it was a little unsettling to watch. As I know, for example, Rob, you're a Bulls fan, but this game had sort of the same feel as Dwayne Wade's first game with Chicago after spending so many years with the Miami Heat. And, in that regard, I think it's just going to take a few games for us as fans to start to perceive this as the new normal. And the Buccaneers, obviously, some would say that today was definitely a weak showing, and you can't argue with that, but they still have high hopes for this season. And obviously most people have stopped betting against Tom Brady, and they stopped doing that quite some time ago. So, wow, 43 years old. He has been doing this longer than we have been alive, Rob.
Yeah, almost more than double that time, honestly.
Yeah.
It's really been something to watch. But I really liked your point on how, even a guy like Tom Brady, who's, been at the height of his profession, he's had so many clutch moments throughout the years. This pandemic waits for no one in terms of the structuring and organizing of this NFL season. It's a new challenge for every single player, no matter how old, how experienced you are. But meanwhile, Brady's replacement, Cam Newton, is bringing an entirely new dimension to this Patriots offense, one with a little more speed and strength coming out of the quarterback position. And Aidan, I think I speak for NFL fans everywhere when I say how strange it was to see New England looking with a dynamic, mobile quarterback like Cam Newton, who had a really strong day against Miami Dolphins. He had 2 rushing touchdowns in a 21-11 win. And going back to the way this new Patriots offense is constructed, it just seems, again, so strange that a tough, kind of grim guy like Bill Belichick is utilizing this incredibly raw, talented, big, really flamboyant, extravagant, whatever you want to call him, player in Cam Newton, whose actions both on and off the field don't really represent, the Patriot way as it has come to be over the last few seasons. But so far, it seems like these polar opposite personalities in Belichick and Newton are making it work. And I think Patriot fans should be excited in the concept of a winning season without Tom Brady, the first in over 20 years.
Yeah, Rob, just speaking to sort of the personality side of things, it's really interesting because Newton was a guy who invested his entire career into all of those Carolina teams, only to be released by most accounts against his will after serving them for 9 seasons. So even for a player of Cam Newton's caliber, it easily could have been a knockout punch for the 31-year-old, as not all changes of scenery really work out in the end for big name players. And not to mention the fact, let's not forget, Cam Newton is literally being paid the minimum sum of money possible under the NFL's collective bargaining, with the exception of all bonuses and incentives, just in terms of what they're paying him on paper. Like it's highway robbery from what we saw today. And as a former MVP, the fact that he was without a job for over a month is really, really shocking. And it's going to be very interesting to see how he deals with the pressure of playing in the environment that is New England, where frankly, people just love to hate you. But that aside, what a big time start for Cam Newton. He definitely came to play today.
He certainly did. And the Patriots, being, the incredibly savvy, smart team that they are getting incredible value out of Newton, like you said, on that minimum contract. And going back to fantasy, he's one of those players we're going to get great value of out of the quarterback position. He's going really late in drafts, and his rushing ability and his talent of getting to the outside with the speed and getting into the end zone with the strength really makes his upside all the more enticing in drafts. But going to the final game I'll mention this week, after an offseason mired in turmoil ranging from a controversial name change to a front office sex scandal to their head coach being diagnosed with cancer, the Washington football team put up 27 unanswered points this afternoon to take down the reigning division champs Philadelphia Eagles. Once down 17-0, quarterback Dwayne Haskins, who tossed 178 yards and a touchdown today, and second overall pick Chase Young out of Ohio State, arguably the most dominant prospect, not just defensive player, prospect in the last few decades of the NFL, had 1.5 sacks and a forced fumble, leading the way on the defensive side of the ball for the football team. It's still so weird to say that, but it was really nice to see them get a win. I felt really bad for their fans all offseason, just all this whole sideshow involving them. Must have felt really good to come away with a win in week 1.
Rob, it was a weird win to start off their season, but all I'm going to say is that there's a lot of weirdness coming out of Washington these days in all regards. So sort of it's fitting as a start to their 2020-2021 season.
And I really like that political analogy you gave there, but that's as far as we'll go into that realm. But I'd like to start our assists, fumbles, and what to watch for this week. And I'll begin with Dodgers star pitcher Clayton Kershaw and his recent announcement of a free virtual baseball camp for middle schoolers and high schoolers called Camp Kersh. It's set to take place of Kershaw's annual Ping Pong for Purpose event that was recently canceled due to COVID-19 concerns, and was originally made to raise money towards education, wellness, and community programs for youth and families. So, it's clear that Clayton Kershaw, a well-known philanthropist, a very devout man of faith, has not let a global pandemic get in the way of him giving back to his community in a great time of struggle and uncertainty.
Definitely, Rob. Big time stuff from a player who is dominating both on and off the field right now. And Camp Kersh is catchy. Personally, I would have gone with Kershey Park, but we can save the discussion for another time. And Rob, you mentioned as your assist of the week a couple of episodes ago, Uncle Pau Gasol, that is, being there with Kobe Bryant's daughters for a nice afternoon on the water. And today, actually, Pau and his wife, Catherine, welcomed their first child into the world, named Elisabet Gianna Gasol, named after the late Gianna Bryant. And it's certainly another meaningful gesture from Pau to honor his fellow Laker legend, as we are given yet another reminder of what a great person Pau is off the court, in addition to his obvious basketball excellence.
For sure, Uncle Pau never disappoints with how great he is on the floor and how kind he is off. My fumble this week will go to Lions running back DeAndre Swift, who committed a brutal game-ending blunder in Detroit's 27-23 loss to my Chicago Bears today. I just hated to see that. Swift, who was a rookie coming off of 3 fantastic years of rushing and pass catching, at the University of Georgia, dropped a wide open pass from quarterback Matthew Stafford in the end zone with just 6 seconds to go in the game. And it was an otherwise solid NFL debut for Swift, who punched in a touchdown right before the end of the first half. But unfortunately for him, his drop and the Lions surrendering 21 unanswered points in the fourth quarter end up as the defining moments in this 27-23 loss to their division rivals.
Definitely. And for me, we already touched on this earlier, but my fumble of the week simply has to go to the Houston Rockets for their performance against the Lakers, as outside of game 1 and a few isolated runs here and there throughout the course of the next 4 games, they just did not seem to be a very spirited group. And I think I said this earlier, they epitomize the adage, it's a make or miss league. But offensive output aside, the one thing you can typically control is effort. And there were times that they simply didn't seem to be playing that hard. And it was a shame, because you and I were sort of hyping up their new look defense a week or 2 ago, and just the way that they've responded to sort of the critiques they received for their small ball approach, just trying to do something that no team has really had the courage to do for quite some time. And, I think, again, the question comes up, where do they go from here? I, again, don't see any major offseason changes coming for them, though I could be wrong. But hopefully a coaching change will do the trick and do some good in terms of instilling a new culture and hopefully turning things around.
Yeah, and the Rockets were really behind the 8 ball the whole series, the way I saw it. Not only were they up against a really strong Lakers team and a LeBron James who was at the peak of his 2020 playoff run, we also have to mention that Danwell House Jr., a forward for the Rockets, who was getting some pretty healthy minutes for that team this postseason, violated safety protocols in the NBA bubble by inviting an unauthorized guest. And he was kicked out for Houston's final 2 games. Not to say he would have made, a great impact in that series and potentially led Houston to a win. But adding that and their opponent, and the fact that, like you said, their effort was sort of lacking in those final few games, certainly did not help Houston's cause at all. But I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out for my what to watch for this week, Cubs pitcher Alec Mills, for tossing a no-hitter this afternoon in just his 14th Major League start en route to a 12-0 victory over the Milwaukee Brewers. Mills, who was a 22nd round pick for the Kansas City Royals back in 2012, had a 4.74 ERA, not very good, coming into today, and became the second pitcher this season to throw a no-hitter, just 18 days after Chicago White Sox pitcher Lucas Giolito no-hit the Pittsburgh Pirates. And in fact, 2020 became the first season in which the Cubs and the White Sox, 2 crosstown rivals, both threw a no-hitter. I'm obviously biased when I say this, but it was a brilliant performance from Alec Mills, who has really been a career underdog. And overall, not a bad day for Chicago fans who saw this, the White Sox winning, and the great Mitchell Trubisky leading a 17-point comeback for the Bears.
Definitely, Rob, and always nice when your hometown team, not hometown, but your preferred team, as the case may be, has an outing like that. So for my what to watch for, I am actually going to shock the world right here and go with a rerun for this week, something people should definitely at the very least check out the highlights for, and that is Austrian Dominic Thiem emerging victorious in a shocking comeback against German Alexander Zverev. This was Thiem's first Grand Slam win, and he won it in historic fashion, becoming the first player to ever come back from 2 sets down to win the U.S. Open final since 1949, 71 years ago now. And he's now the second Austrian Grand Slam champion in history, as well as the youngest to win a Grand Slam since 2009 at just 27 years old. And it was definitely an inspiring performance for a player that historically has struggled in these finals. He was 0-3 coming into today. And once again, it's definitely at least worth a look at the highlights if you don't have time to sit down and watch the entirety of what was really a grueling match for both opponents. And Rob, that's 2 straight weeks now of tennis shout-outs from us. So go us.
I love it. I hope we can make it 3 next week.
So that about wraps things up for episode 7 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. Unknowingly, I wore a number 7 jersey today to commemorate, and that was not scripted. I just thought of it. But thank you for listening, and as always, catch you at the same time next week for episode 8.